Welcome to Larne's Curran Park, site of a very unique memorial in honour of all those many immigrants who left this part of the world for what became the United States of America. This statue, the Memorial to the Immigrants, was unveiled in 1992 to commemorate over 250,000 people who left these shores seeking a better life in America. The statue itself is very unique. I remember when it was brought here, it was cast in Dublin and literally came on the back of a lorry all the way up the motorway, and then a crane dropped it over from the other side of the park here into this area. The sculptor is a man called Ed Barton, and Ed sought to portray a family unit from what was called the Scotch-Irish community in terms of American history. Ulster Scots, largely Presbyterians, who left the Ulster counties for America from 1717 onwards, and the sculpture shows that they took very little with them, many of them, but they certainly would have taken the family Bible as portrayed here, symbolic of their faith, and also the fact that all the family documents were kept inside the Bible, any legal documents and family ancestry, family trees and so on. They're a rugged looking bunch, and that's because these were quite rugged people, quite used to trial and tribulation. They were farming people. They didn't have it very easy here, and that was one of the reasons why they left. There was severe frosts for a period in 1717, we know, and also there were famines in the 18th century that would have ensured that people were thinking of moving elsewhere if they could. Also rents were increasing on land, and the big draw was that there was free and available land in the American colonies, particularly in the Carolinas, where many from this part of the world ended up. I particularly like the little design on the statue here. The boy is carrying his shoes so as not to wear out the leather, but the shoes are designed as a bird bath by the sculptor, so it's a nice little aspect to this particular statue. Now, the memorial itself was unveiled to commemorate the start of the immigration, and a little ship called the Friends Goodwill, a bit of an enigma in terms of history. We know that the Friends Goodwill set sail from Larne on or about the 1st of May 1717, and we know that she had 52 passengers on board. When she got into the Atlantic, it was no short voyage that these people were embarking on. Nowadays we can cross the Atlantic in 7 hours on an aeroplane, but back then this ship left May 1717 and finally arrived in Boston Harbour in September that year, so it was a long time to be at sea. Their food supplies almost ran out because of adverse weather conditions, and they had to get food from another ship that was passing on the way back across the Atlantic. One of the passengers died on the voyage as well. But we do know they arrived in Boston Harbour. We don't know very much about who was on that ship. No ship's list has survived. So in some ways the Friends Goodwill is quite symbolic, and it's symbolic of all those thousands upon thousands upon thousands of immigrants who left, not all of whom are known to history, just known to their own families. The memorial was unveiled in 1992 by Professor Bobby Moss of South Carolina, one of the foremost Scotch-Irish experts in terms of history at that time. And it also includes a quote from the Tyrone poet W.F. Marshall: "There is no other race in the United States that can produce a roll of honour so long and so shining with distinction." And that's because these people did play a very important role. Sometimes it was a role that was very visible. They occupied the White House. The first of them to occupy the White House was Andrew Jackson, for example, whose parents were from Bonnybefore and Carrickfergus. And upwards of 20 other presidents then had ancestral connections to the Ulster counties. So that was a very visible presence. But there was also the element of them clearing the land, being farmers, building towns, all of those things that helped to shape America. So these people played a very important part, and this statue tries to put that across, I suppose, to people who come here into this park and to people who come and visit Larne. So it's very unique, and it's a very fitting tribute to what is an amazing story. So today I'm going to invite you to join me to travel around from the Curran Park, around Larne Town Centre, to some other sites that are of American interest here, as part of an American walking trail to mark the Friends Goodwill Festival. So I hope you'll join me. This is Larne's Curran Road. It's hard to imagine, but back in 1942, the rumble of tanks would have been very prevalent here, coming from the harbour up through the centre of the town. About 200 tanks from the American Army had landed at Larne, and they were part of the American Expeditionary Force that had come to Northern Ireland, largely for training in preparation for the return to Europe of the Allied forces. So there's a little plaque here that commemorates the American presence, and it was quite a presence in the town itself. Baylands, not very far from where we are, was where there was a camp, and also other areas, Kilwater, Red Hall at Ballycarry, and elsewhere all around the town. The American troops had arrived here in Northern Ireland in January 1942 after the United States entered the war following Pearl Harbor. And in this area, a very famous regiment was formed at Carrickfergus called the US Rangers, the only American regiment formed outside of the United States. And they were a Special Forces regiment. They still exist today. And they trained at Sunnylands at Carrickfergus. And then they came down to Larne to get themselves across to Scotland, to the Highlands, where they undertook commando training. Prior to Operation Torch, which was the invasion of North Africa and Italy as well. So this little plaque is just a reminder. It's one of a series of blue plaques that were put up in 1992 by the Ulster American Committee when they started off the commemoration for the Friends Goodwill and the strong American connections that exist in the area. I don't know how your geography is in terms of the United States, but if I asked you where the state of Louisiana was, you probably wouldn't say somewhere behind me in the North Channel. But in fact, there's a ship called the State of Louisiana, which is out there on a little shelf of rock. And she went down there on Christmas Day, 1878. She was part of the State Line Company, and they travelled back and forth to Larne, New York and Glasgow. The State Line came here in 1873, and in 1878, unfortunately, when the state of Louisiana was coming towards Larne, there was a buoy out there at the Hunter Rock, which they took their bearings from. Unbeknown to the captain, the buoy had slipped, and so he got a false bearing, ended up on a shelf of rock. Everyone rescued from the ship, thankfully, but the vessel is still out there on the shelf, the remnants of it today. And it's a reminder of the transatlantic shipping connection that Larne had, largely brought about by the efforts of James Mchenry MP, whose memorial is down on the shore here, very familiar memorial to people from Larne and also from people coming in and across from Scotland. And that was erected in the 1880s. Mchenry developed the port of Larne, along with the port of Stranraer in Scotland, became a regular cross-channel link, and then he developed this link with New York as well, with the State Line Company. So it's a reminder that It's quite a small world, even in the 19th century, and there were these connections that would have taken people across. Many of the people who went on the state line ships were going to seek a new life in the United States as well. A bit like the Friends Goodwill, only these ships were much more robust and sturdy and made that voyage much quicker than the Friends Goodwill would have done. And the Friends Goodwill herself would not have sailed from the port of Larne as we know it today. The harbour area changed, and in the town centre there was also a lot of harbour area there too. The ship would have probably have sat off the town a little bit. Smaller vessels, small boats would have brought them out to the Friends Goodwill, and then she'd have set sail out into the mouth of Larne Harbour on her way, on her journey then. So lots of other ships, hundreds of them over the years, have been back and forward, and a lot of those were part of an American voyage. So Larne had close links with Charleston, or Charlestown as it was in South Carolina, and that's how so many people from this part of the world ended up in the Carolinas and the southern states of the United States, because those were the ports of preference that the ships were going to. So an interesting reminder of a very strong seafaring tradition, and somewhere out there Louisiana is resting under the waves. Two churches in Larne have windows that were donated by members of the congregations that emigrated and made a new life in the United States, and this is one of them, Larne Methodist Church. The Reverend Dr. James Boyd Brady was connected to this congregation. The Boyd and the Brady families were very significant families within the history of the Methodist congregation in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. He emigrated to the United States in 1867, and he became a very prominent Methodist minister. He was responsible for churches at New York and Boston and elsewhere in the United States. And the People's Temple in Boston, when he was there, was regarded as the largest Methodist congregation in the world. So he was quite a significant figure. He donated the chancel window here in this church, which was built in the 1880s. And it's one of two that are connected and that have a blue plaque to commemorate that connection. And Dr. Boyd Brady was from Mcwhirder, just outside the town on the boundary between Killyglen and Mcwhirder. And he certainly didn't forget his hometown, as this congregation are aware every time they're in the church when they see the fantastic window that he presented to the congregation. Often there are interesting overlaps of history, and I'm always reminded at the Methodist Church when I see the Brady plaque there to Dr. Brady, and I'm reminded about his window that he donated. Also there's a fantastic photograph of a lady from Larne called Ruby Mcwhirder, and Ruby was one of Larne's GI brides, and she was married at the Methodist Church, and it's pictured just outside there with her husband Charles Rudensky. And there were quite a number of GI brides from that Second World War period who left Larne, made a new life for themselves in the United States, in her case in Baltimore. This location, St. McNissy's Church at Agnew Street, there's also a little overlap there because there's a fantastic painting by the late Sam McLarnon of American GI soldiers inside the church having a mass before they embark to Europe for what became known as the D-Day landings. So there's overlaps between the 19th and the 20th centuries in a number of locations. The overlap also here that's very relevant relates to a man called Bishop James Augustine McFall, and he was born in 1850. He was taken by his parents to America as he was just a small baby at that time, so he wouldn't have any real recollections of his homeland, but there's a lovely family tradition that as they went over the hills beyond Larne to get to the vessel that would take them to America, father lifted him above his shoulders to look back on Larne. And he certainly did look back on Larne in his later life, because he came back to Larne in 1906 and he donated a window, a beautiful stained glass window, to this church in memory of his parents. And by that time he had become very, very prominent, of course. He was the Bishop of Trenton in New Jersey, and he held a number of important clerical appointments before that as well. But he was on his way to a convention in Rome when he called here in Larne in 1906, and you can imagine that was a major event for the Catholic congregation here, because somebody had become so prominent who was associated with this congregation of St Mcnissy's. So a fantastic building here, and this blue plaque is another reminder of the American connections there, which tells you the story of Bishop McFall and his career within the church, and the link to Rory's Glen townland at Mcwhirder, which is where the family came from and where they departed from in 1850. Well, here we are in the centre of Larne town itself. But you need to use your imagination here, because just across from us was the old harbour area. And the clue, of course, is in the street names here: Coggle Row, Quay Street, and indicating to us that there was a quay down here, and that the harbour was just in front of where the big roundabout is now. Large ships couldn't have come in, but small vessels, fishing boats and so on, would have come in at that stage. But this is all reclaimed then from the sea. So back to ancient times, this area was known as a sheltered location. Ships would have come into the loch for shelter during storms out in the North Channel. They'd have had safe anchorage here, and we have an account from the 2nd century AD by the Romans that a Roman galley came here for repairs in the shelter of the loch back then. So back in the 18th century, Larne was a very different place, and we had the sea just a few yards away from where I'm standing, running right across along past Murrayfield and the area of the large car parks today, all of that reclaimed. So whenever the first emigrant ship set sail, people would have probably come down here to get small vessels to go out to the Friends Goodwill on their journey to America. So you can imagine lots of old sail vessels out in the areas where we can see now up into the loch at anchor, using that as a safe harbour, and then people would have taken the small vessels from the shallow water here out to the deeper water where they were. That's how it would have operated back then. But a lot of people pass by and don't really think much about these names, but Coggle Row, Quay Street, for me they tell you of a different story, and an older story here in Larne. Well, we've reached the head of the town district of Larne in our journey today, and we're at the Old Presbyterian Church of Larne and Mcwhirder. In the grounds here is another of the blue plaques commemorating American connections, and this one relates to the Breckinridge family, and most particularly to a Vice President of the United States, John Cable Breckinridge. The Breckinridges were from Ayrshire, and they came across in the 17th century to this part of the world. They lived at Ballyrickard Beg townland, which is near Raleigh, outside Larne, and by 1737 some of them had emigrated to America. They went first to Virginia, where many families from the area also ended up, and they were in a place called Tinkling Springs in Virginia for a time. John Cable Breckinridge's great-great-great-grandfather was the man who was associated with Tinkling Springs in Virginia, and his descendant became very prominent. He was born in 1821. He became a Vice President of the United States at a very crucial time in American history, just before the American Civil War broke out. And that war between the states cost America dearly. John Cable Breckinridge, as Vice President, had a dilemma, and he opted to side with the Confederate side in this debate. He became a Confederate Secretary of War, effectively. By the end of the war, he was the last government minister remaining from the Confederate cabinet. But Kentucky, where the Breckinridges had then settled, was a divided state, and Kentucky remained within the Union, but many of those in Kentucky joined the Confederate forces. And Breckinridge was to refer to those forces as the Orphan Brigade because of this dislocation between the state, which remained in the Union, and a lot of the people who were Confederates at heart. Very complicated period in American history. It is, of course, about slavery, but it's about much more than that, about economic systems and so on too, and the issue of states' rights, which was guarded very jealously by the Confederate states, who argued that they had the right to secede. The Union argued they didn't have, and of course we all know the outcome was that terrible Civil War. John Cable Breckinridge fled to Europe and Canada. He visited the British Isles at one time during that period, but he eventually wanted to go back to the United States, and he did so. He became a figure or symbol of reconciliation, and it was expected that for the centenary of the United States in 1876 that John Cable Breckinridge would be the man invited to deliver a keynote address. Unfortunately, he died in 1875, just before that situation came about, but he was seen as a great figure for the reconciliation of the divided United States of America. And when he died, his funeral procession in Lexington in Kentucky was 1 mile long of a cortege, which says something about the respect in which he was held. One newspaper made the comment that effectively the United States had been united. It said, "There is now no North and no South." So quite a story attached to this plaque and to the person whom it commemorates and the family that were connected to this particular part of the town. The American Civil War, of course, had very prominent figures from this part of the world, descendants of people who had emigrated on both sides. So you had John Cable Breckinridge, you had Stonewall Jackson, you had Ulysses Simpson Grant on the Confederate and Union sides. And Grant, of course, the great Union general, he became president and was the only one of those who had their connections here, who entered the White House, who actually came back and visited Northern Ireland. He came back after he was president and went to County Tyrone, which was where his ancestors had come from, near Ballygawley. This is a fascinating old cemetery, and lots of detail on these old gravestones, family histories, information about occupations, and just coats of arms. Just a fascinating place, and of course the oldest cemetery in Larne. I like it too because just in a little corner there is the grave of a little dog called Sting. So there's a little plaque up to him too, and he was owned by one of the mill owners here, a man called Barclay, who was associated with the congregation. But this is a fantastic church, St Sedma's, going back to medieval times, and lots of interest in terms of families connected to the congregation and interred here in the cemetery. And we've come to look at a particular individual with a very strong American connection, a man called Dr. James Mchenry. And James Mchenry was a novelist as well as a medical doctor, and it's through his career as a novelist that we principally remember him today. James Mchenry was born in Larne in 1785, and as a boy he witnessed some very stirring events in the town. 1798 saw what is called the United Irish Rising, known locally as the Turnout or Turnout, and in this area certainly a very Presbyterian event. Now there was a Battle of Larne. Larne was captured by the insurgents, and as a young boy James Mchenry witnessed all these events and heard all about them from his family afterwards as well. So he promised his aunt apparently that he would write a novel about the 1798 Rising in Larne, and this is the realisation of that promise. A really tiny little book called O'Halloran or The Insurgent Chief, which was first published in 1820. This is an 1824 version of it, so it may be small, but it's certainly packed in terms of the font size here in the story. And it tells this story through the use of the actual events, but the characters' names are changed, but we do know who all the characters are. He left an account of who each person was in the fictionalized version of his novel. And it wasn't the only novel he would write. He also wrote another one called Hearts of Steel, which was set in the 1770s. And when he went to the United States, he wrote a number of novels there as well, and an epic poem called The Antediluvians. He also is accredited as the man who first introduced an Ulster family into American fiction, which he did in the novel The Wilderness. So he's quite a prominent figure. His stone here is quite a modest little stone. It's in the Smiley plot. His mother was a member of the Smiley family who were very prominent in Larne, and his father was George Mchenry, who was a merchant in the town. James went and studied as a medical doctor, and then he went to the United States. He married a girl from Curran Castle called Jane Robinson, who was actually his cousin. So they had 4 children, 2 here and 2 in the United States. And they became quite a prominent and wealthy family. George Mchenry was appointed as the American consul in Londonderry, and he came back to live, and he lived in Larne, and he died in Larne in 1845 in one of the hotels in the town, and was interred here. So he's quite a prominent figure as a novelist and somebody from the arts world. And the gravestone here does mention that he's author of O'Halloran, etc., which relates to all his other novels as well. Smileys would continue to be long associated with the town, laterally with Dromalis House into the 1930s, but a long association with Larne from the 18th century when they first came across from Scotland. There's other arts links as well in the town. Whitford Keane, who was regarded as the best Shakespearean actor in the United States, was born in Larne, and in 1911 he performed a play at the Victoria Hall called The Drone. So lots of connections and lots of interest in terms of the United States associated with this town and with the people from this town, and hopefully our little walking tour has given a flavour of that. There's much more to explore, and there's much more history to explore, particularly in places like this where history is just all around you. So I hope you will take the opportunity when you can to visit some of these sites and to maybe learn a little bit more about the areas that we've covered in this online walk through history.